Well, first of all, thank you very much, all of you, for coming. I'm very grateful to have an audience. I'll drink to that one. We've raised our glasses once, but we can raise them again. Now, I've really enjoyed putting this stuff together, and I realised that somebody said to me, well, why should I do a talk on smuggling in North Devon? Why am I interested? Well, I realised that actually, firstly, I've lived here in North Devon for 24 years. And I'm still awestruck by its coastal scenery. I've immense respect for these waters, and my maritime past fuels my fascination for the folk whose livelihoods relied on the wind and the tides. I was born into a sailing mad family and spent every childhood holiday on or close to the sea. By 17 years old, I'd sailed from England to France several times, and to Spain and Portugal. And then at 19, my brother and I sailed a 24-foot wooden sailing boat from Exmouth all the way to Mallorca. Each of those trips in my youth had their scary moments. So I've experienced firsthand the full force of the sea. North Devon's coast waters are subject to huge tides, twice the height of the south coast, one of the largest tidal differences in the world, causing very fast-flowing rip tides and really rough inshore coastal waters. I only venture out on the water here in North Devon on a well-powered mini rib, and I keep my sailing to the much kinder south coastal waters. So after a recent find in a second-hand bookshop at Christmas, and then listening to a friend's Zoom talk on Barnstable maritime history, I thought it would be fun to find out a bit more about local smuggling. This picture's called the Smuggling Run. So I've chosen to talk about North Devon's smuggling past between the years of about the early 1600s and the late 1800s. Now, smuggling in North Devon was stimulated by poverty and lack of prevention. There are very early records of some smuggling in Ilfracombe in 1585, but smuggling in North Devon and nationally mushroomed from the 1680s due to excessive taxation combined with extreme poverty, and it was certainly facilitated by the development of the boats. This is we'll recognise that at the Custom House, the Barnstable Custom House, but unfamiliar with the ship's masts. So, in the 1680s, the government needed money to pay for unpopular wars being fought in Europe. The existing customs taxes that had been in place since the 1200s for import and export of goods wasn't bringing them enough revenue, so they introduced a new taxation called excise, which was an extra tax put on luxury consumable goods such as spirits, tea, coffee, fine wine, matches, and even silks and laces. These were widely resented by a mainly 80% rural population who were often close to starvation. So also in the late 17th century, boats were developed, late 17th century, the boats were developed, so their sails were rigged parallel with their keels and in front and behind the mast, like most of today's sailing boats, as you can see in this picture. This enabled them to take the wind on either side of the boat, and it meant they could sail into the wind and consequently made them much more manoeuvrable. They could access the small rocky bays, offload goods, and then sail straight back out, not having to rely on tides, no longer having to go with the flow. So the contraband, some Sailor Jerry's rum, drunk on my little boat. So French brandy, Dutch gin, rum from the Caribbean, fine wines, tea, coffee, fine silks, lace, and even candlesticks and playing cards are all in the records of seized contraband in North Devon. The spirits and wines for smuggling were originally transported in smaller barrels. If you look at the chap who's standing in the doorway, you'll see the small barrels. These were called a half anchor, and they were small enough to sling two together and throw over their shoulders or ponies' backs. There were larger tubs for spirits. They were barrels. These are called a hogshead, and they carried 5 gallons apiece. However, by 1750, these small containers, which were ideal for transporting smuggling in, were banned for importing. And these goods, the small containers were banned for importing these goods in an attempt to prevent the smuggling. And our local records reported that in 1785, a 96-gallon cask of rum was found at Watermouth Cove. Now, the tidesman who worked for the revenue, he went to report it in Ilfracombe, and by the time he actually got back, it was gone. And then again in 1801, 224 gallons of gin and 164 gallons of brandy were found on the foreshores of Ilfracombe, and hence the name Brandy Bay. Now, who were the smugglers? Well, the smugglers were both local and often foreign opportunists, taking advantage of the high demand for cheaper luxury goods. Now, a smuggling run involved many local people and was extremely lucrative. The obvious smugglers were the seafarers, of which there were many. The waterways were the highways for all trade, and highly skilled local sailors knew their waters in intricate detail and could navigate safely even in the dead of night, making it very hard for the revenue preventives to intercept. These were the skippers of privateers, the pilots, the fishermen, the ferrymen, and even in Braunton, almost every family owned a boat. The less obvious are the land crew, the spotters to guide the boats ashore. These were the lookout crew who signalled to the boats to indicate when the coast was clear to come ashore and land the contraband safely. Then there were the landing crew. The carrying crew, usually strong farm labourers to offload and transport the contraband inland to safe storage locations, commonly cellars and outhouses. The tubmen could carry the 5-gallon barrels, whilst the accompanying batsmen were the heavies employed to see off the preventers. These men could earn almost a week's wages just from helping on one smuggling run. A smuggling run was a risky affair involving many folk. They were carefully planned and accurately executed operations, and it's where the sayings "on the spot" and "the coast is clear" come from. Finally, the other people involved, the consumers. Back to this picture, they're obviously having a delivery of smuggled goods. So in North Devon and the southwest, whole communities connived in the trade and profited from it. They funded the smuggling runs on a small-scale club schemes where nearly everyone put a small amount of money towards a run. This offered much more protection from the revenue men, and no one individual would lose too much if it failed. Interestingly, a list of southwest smugglers taken from the records of the Lyme Regis County Court in the 1780s records illustrated the diversity of folk involved. There was a quarryman, a dressmaker, a tin plate maker, a ferryman, a cobbler, a butcher, flax dresser, innkeeper, chairman, shoemaker, twine spinner, miller, etc. Everyone involved. So, smuggling in North Devon. I've got this picture of a hen's mouth because of the lime kiln that's clearly visible in the picture there. So, the official records of smuggling are mainly of prevention, but there are many folk tales, traditional yarns, and hearsay, which are the main content for this presentation. So there are many, many stories of smuggling from the late 1600s, but the first official records from the early 1700s indicate that these remote sites of these lime kilns were the perfect locations for smuggling contraband. In 1718, this is the Bristol Channel, and you can see Lundy, bottom left. And in 1718, several French ships were reported as waiting in the Bristol Channel to put wine and brandy onto the vessels carrying limestone to North Devon. The vessels bringing limestone from Ireland and Wales were ideal for intercepting and transferring contraband from larger foreign ships mid-channel and then secretly offloading at the remote kiln signs like Heddon's Mouth. There are many tales of really rough smuggling gangs that operated the length of our coastline, and far worse, the illicit and more sinister operation of wrecking to plunder ships' cargoes. North Devon was known as the sailor's grave. From Lee Bay to Combe Martin, there are many stories about caves and tunnels that wreckers and smugglers allegedly used to hide and transport contraband. The tunnels at Ilfracombe, the renowned Clovelly Cave, Joe Moon's Cave, and Tom Norman's Hole was built by quarrymen for smugglers to use, and Sampson's Cave and Sampson's Bay were named after a local smuggler. However, smugglers didn't often use the caves. They would prefer the open where they could escape. And it was far more likely that they'd have transported the goods immediately, taking advantage of the deep-sided ravine-type valleys associated with the small rocky beaches renowned for smuggling in North Devon. This picture, you can see the remote, that the lime kiln that I showed you, Heddon's Mouth, is right at the bottom of that. So that's a really clear picture of how remote these lime kilns were and how these had these wonderful hidden ravine type valleys going inland. So they were far less likely to be caught by the preventives if the contraband was immediately transported inland and hidden. North Devon smuggling was mainly done in the calmer, sunnier summer months due to the rugged coastline and a pounding westerlies. And its situation in the Bristol Channel was to the smugglers' advantage. It was a busy high road of its time, being used by many local and international trading vessels. Those returning from the Americas colonies would have been loaded with valuable goods for import, and often French, Dutch ships would loiter offshore waiting to offload spirits and wines onto smaller local vessels. So this lovely picture of Ilfracombe Harbour, where you can see the smaller lugger. The lugger is the small boat on the right-hand side, as I showed you before, which could take the sails on both sides, and a bit slightly bigger boat with the traditional square riggers weren't so versatile. So it was easy for the local trading boats to intercept the larger ones and bring the contraband ashore illegally. And smugglers were known to have used Lee, Ilfracombe, Heddon's Mouth, Watermouth Cove, Mort and Clovelly to do so. So now I'm actually going to go to and talk about the local tales. I'm actually going to start off with showing you, I'll just expand that one. That is the coastline we're talking about. Obviously, North Devon, the border with Cornwall, just south of Hartland Point and Bideford Bay, and that coastline going up to Lynmouth. So Hartland was renowned for smuggling, but the stories linked to Hartland revolve around tales of cruel Copinger, who was head of the worst smuggling gang in Cornwall, and he lived in the Cornish village of Morwenstow, which is just across the border into Cornwall, and that's another story. So I'm going to start with Clovelly. Lovely picture of Clovelly here. So Clovelly, east from Hartland Point, with direct access to Bideford Bay, was a safe haven from the pounding westerly storms and that battered most of the North Devon coastline. It had a notorious reputation as a smuggler's haunt, and certainly many a smuggler's luggers left the well-protected harbour there. There was a local legend about cannibals in Clovelly who kept salted human flesh in barrels hidden in a cave in the east of the village that must have been spread by the smugglers to keep inquisitive visitors away. And the pub, the Red Lion at Clovelly, was a popular pub for smugglers, well worth a visit. So on to Bideford. going to expand that one. I love that picture. That's actually Bideford with the bridge there, Bideford Harbour, looking over towards the main street. So the most renowned North Devon smuggler was a Thomas Benson of Bideford. He set up an ingenious plot to outwit the revenue. He had inherited a huge wealth from his father, Knapp House in Appledore and lots of land, and including a fleet of ships that plied the Americas colonies and would return laden with luxury goods, and in particular, tobacco. More tobacco was imported through Bideford than anywhere else in the country apart from London, and it must be Benson of Benson and Hedges. The Benson galleons were armed with 20 guns as protection from pirates. Benson was a well-respected man, and in 1747 he became MP for Barnstable. And the following year he was granted a lease from Lord Gower for Lundy Island, and he also gained a contract from the government to ship convicts abroad. However, some of those convicts he delivered to Lundy, where Thomas used them to build a tobacco processing plant and storage facility. He would legally import his shiploads of tobacco into Bideford, and he'd avoid paying the import taxes, claiming the goods tax exempt because they were for re-exportation. But he'd export them out offshore to Lundy, which was not under the jurisdiction of any English port. His trick, though, was to then re-import the processed tobacco illegally. This is another one of Bideford Quay here. I quite like that picture. But the revenue were perplexed and for many years. But he was eventually charged with smuggling, stripped of his office, and fined a huge sum of money which he couldn't pay back. His lands in Bideford were taken, and in an attempt to get some money, he had one of his ships scuppered for the insurance, but he was found out. So he fled to Portugal, where he lived out the rest of his life. There was actually another Thomas who used Lundy for smuggling, and in 1785, Thomas Knight moved there, and he was ejected from Barry, and he enjoyed it for his smuggling. So moving on to Barnstable, back to this lovely picture of the customs house. Obviously, that's a bit later than the dates we're talking about, but now the Barnstable stories recorded were actually about the customs officials. There was a centuries-old tradition of fraud at the port of Barnstable, and a reported case was of a suspected illegally issued license given to a Major General Campbell to export grain. It was illegal to export grain if the price went over a certain amount. And whilst the cargo was being loaded under the customs supervision, a mob of locals were up in arms. They tried to obstruct the loading cargo, taking 600 bushels of corn from the granary and even smashed the window of the owner's house. So on to Braunton, which included Saunton Beach, were also under the port of Barnstable. The Barnstable customs officers also had to deal with wrecks, as the dutiable goods washed up theoretically should be declared to the customs. But if a ship ran aground and the crew of the ship perished, the local landowner or tenant farmers were allowed to salvage some of the cargo. It was about 50% of the cargo, and that was called a fair lynch. Although that's not Saunton Beach, that's the best I could get to a beach with a ship aground. However, illegal salvaging was very lucrative for poor rural folk, so any sign of a floundering ship in the bay would bring locals flocking to the scene. Customs officers would often be outnumbered by hundreds of locals plundering the broken ribs of the beached ship. Now, the entrance to the Tor estuary is very narrow channel between the surf breaking on Westward Hoe and Saunton beaches, and you can see it in this chart. It's angled towards Saunton and also has a shallow bar in the middle. So in high westerly winds and big swells, it was a treacherous approach for those sailing traders, and it was where many vessels over those years were wrecked. One of those reported were wrecks that the customs had to deal with on Saunton Beach was a ship called the Beulah. By the time the Barnstable tide surveyor reached the wreck, locals swarmed around, taking salvage for themselves, one of whom, the wife of a Richard Budd, assaulted the tide surveyor with a ladle. The poor man was apparently unaware that she was the wife of a tenant farmer to the local manor and thus entitled to salvage. Apparently, a barrel of rum was also washed up, which the woman opened, sharing with the poor, cold, wet locals. And apparently she became so inebriated that she fell off her horse on her way home. So, going on, this is a view out towards the beach. I'm afraid it's a bit misty, but that's actually the Burrows, and actually you can normally see the beach. It just wasn't a very good photograph. So the name of a farm on the most northern edge of Braunton, with its unrivaled views and proximity to Saunton Beach, owes its name to the old seafaring law of salvage and reveals its true beginnings. I discovered a few years ago, firstly, that the manor was built in 1620, and at that time it owned all of the land adjacent to Saunton Beach. And whilst chatting to a local electrician who rewired it, that the oak beams underneath the floorboards were all from old boats, most likely taken from a wreck. At the last presentation I did of this, a gentleman piped up at the end and he said he actually was a plumber and he'd worked on this property 30 years ago, and all of the wood upstairs in the bedrooms, he said it was amazing, with all wood from ships, beautiful oak. So the wood at that size and that quality was very scarce in North Devon. So the farm salvaged the hulks of wood from the shipwrecked boats to help construct the manor house, which is called Fair Lynch. So most farms were very poor, and there was speculation as to how this farm had found so much wealth. But as they owned the land adjacent to the beach, they also had rights to many a fair lynch. The owner of the house was delighted when I told him this, because he didn't know about the name, that fair lynch, what fair lynch meant. Okay, on to, this is a chart again. You can see on the left it's Mort Point, and actually Woolacombe Bay is actually Mort Bay, and that's the northern coast going up to Lynmouth. The coast from Mort Point to Lynmouth is privy to many tales of smugglers and wreckers. Mort Hoe, Lee, Heel and Heddon's Mouth were all haunts of smugglers and wreckers. This really was the sailor's grave, hence the name Mort, French for death. Mort Stone off Mort Point is aptly named, and below Damage Hills there are many jagged rocks strewn along the coastline, rising steeply from the seabed to just below the surface, where they were the demise of many a ship. So the OS map here gives us, along this stretch of coastline, the names of many features give away its murky past. So the names of the pubs, the ship aground, the smugglers, and Lookout Hill, Damage Barton, you can see Damage Barton right in the middle there, and Damage Hills. And you can also see Conniver Valley. It's not spelt very well, but if you actually say it as it sounds, it's Conniver. So I'm going to go on. This is a picture of the coast path from just east of Bull Point, and that's in the foreground is Lee Bay, and in the background you can just see Ilfracombe. If you've walked the coast path from Mort Point to Ilfracombe and on to Lynmouth, you're well aware of the series of steep-sided valleys with streams emptying onto the small rocky beaches. These hidden rocky coves with ravine-type valleys running inland were perfect for secret transport of contraband. Bennett's Mouth, a perfect example. Close to, but completely concealed from Mort Hoe, is Bennett's Mouth, just east of Bull Point, and the stream that runs onto the beach can be followed on foot all the way up Conniver Valley. And very well hidden. This is a picture of Conniver Valley, the path actually that goes up Conniver Valley. The path goes all the way up to Damaged Barton, which lies away inland. So if I zoom in a bit, so when you look at Conniver Valley, you can see that valley was very, very hidden all the way up to Damaged Barton. It's well worth a walk round there and have a look. I'd love to look in Damaged Barton actually, but again, Damaged Barton would have owned the whole of that coast, so it did have salvage rights too. So, so this really was a perfect coastline for hardy local smugglers, and far worse than the smugglers were the wreckers who also operated from these cliffs and beaches. Wrecks and wreckers. It was very profitable to wreck a ship to ensure there were no survivors and claim salvage. This coastline was allegedly the home of ruthless wreckers who lured ships ashore at night with misplaced lights. And once it was aground, they plundered the cargoes. And if even one crew member survived, salvage was not allowed, so they would bludgeon any survivors to death. No one was brave enough to report these thugs to the authorities for fear of their own lives. This is Mort Point, Mort Stone there, on a rather nice day, but obviously if you've walked around there, you know how fast the tide rips through there. And if you have a sailing boat with not much wind in sails, it would have no chance. So from 1750 to 1850, Mort Rock was said to have had at least 50 wrecks. But after a local reverend documented the 1850 wrecking of the ship, the Thomas Crisp on Mort Stone, at which an Elizabeth Berry was caught using a pitchfork to drown poor shipwrecked sailors, plans to build a lighthouse on Bull Point commenced. It was only finished in 1878, but the wrecks ceased. Lee Bay. Lee Bay was perfect for smuggling. Sheltered from the westerly swells, its hidden beaches only accessible by sea, a secret path through the rocks and a network of hidden footpaths inland to remote farms, cut off from the rest of the world. A man called Hannibal Richards was the most notorious smuggler known to have operated from Lee. He moved here in 1789, and he had once one of Cruel Copinger's gang. He was tall, dark, and swarthy. There were stories of luring a ship into the bay by tying a lantern to a donkey's tail and walking it on the beach to make it appear to be a ship at anchor, so seemingly safe for another ship to come closer in. But once the ship was to be splintered on the rocks, the killing would begin. You certainly wouldn't want to meet him on a dark night. He had several close shaves with the Coast Guard and the Revenue, and after a raid where he was the only one of his gang who escaped, he retired, and he died in 1849, aged 85, and his relatives, he's got several relatives still buried at Lee. Oh, there was a documented ship, the Wilberforce, in 1842, that was lured into Lee and wrecked and plundered. So on to Ilfracombe. Oh, there's a nice picture of Lee. Going on to Ilfracombe, back to our Ilfracombe picture. So the revenue collector for Ilfracombe in the mid-1700s had only 4 unarmed revenue officers as preventives locally. He complained to the government that Ilfracombe was the forgotten outpost. Now, there was a smuggler called William Cook, who was actually a wealthy Ilfracombe privateer. He was a known smuggler, and he owned the Ilfracombe brigantine called Jane. I'm going to drink to Jane. Please raise your glasses. I didn't know they called ships Jane. Anyway, and despite illegal cargoes found on board Jane, he always somehow managed to evade prosecution. It was reported that in 1817 he landed 300 tubs, 5 gallons in each tub, of Holland's gin and French brandy at Lee, and 300 further tubs the following day at Woody Bay. And then again in 1820 he landed 1,500 gallons of spirits at Lee, and on the following day a similar amount at Withy. Customs never managed to catch Cook, but being son-in-law to Thomas Rudd, who was the revenues collector for Ilfracombe, probably helped. So from Ilfracombe, again, the place names along the coastline also bear witness to the town's connections with smuggling. There's Breakneck Point and Brandy Bay, Brandy Cove there, where 164 gallons of brandy were found on the foreshore. So moving on to Heel. So Heel Bay, as you can see in the centre at the top there, Heel Bay and Chambercombe Manor. If you look at in the bay of Heel Beach there, you can see the stream. The line of the stream follows all the way up Heel Valley. It's a caravan park now, and it goes all the way up to Chambercombe Manor, which is very historic house, part 11th century. So Heel Bay and Chambercombe Manor. Heel has many tales associated with caves and tunnels. An underground passage supposedly linked the bay to Chambercombe Manor away inland, but it was much more likely that they used a very hidden valley adjacent to the manor that was heavily wooded at the top and ends up on the beach. Wrecking and smuggling at Heel was linked for many years with the manor that was inhabited by generations of crooks, land sharks and desperados. So in the 1850s, when roof renovations were being undertaken, the owner found a blocked off secret room with the bones of a dead lady lying on a bed. It was allegedly a wealthy young woman who was washed ashore after a ship was wrecked in Heel Bay in the 1650s. There is a tragic story that they tell at the manor about her. Alexander Otway occupied Chambercombe Manor from 1600s and was associated with a gang of smugglers and wreckers. His wife died, leaving him a son, William, who, as an inquisitive boy, following his father one night and witnessed the horrific spectacle of his father's gang wrecking a ship, William ran away from home to live with his aunt and uncle in Cornwall. He met Ellen, who became his wife. This is obviously when he'd grown up. And they had a daughter called Kate, who years later married a wealthy Irish naval officer called Duncan Wallace, and she went off to live in Ireland. And soon after she left, William's father Alexander died, so William returned to Chambercombe to claim his inheritance. The manor was extremely run down, and William struggled to pay for the repairs. So when he witnessed one night a wreck at Heel Bay, at which a wealthy woman was washed ashore, injured beyond recognition, she was brought back to the manor, and she died soon after. William decided to keep her jewellery to fund the renovations, so he hid her body in the room and blocked it up so as not to be found out. But sadly, he later heard from locals that on board the ship was Kate Wallace, his daughter, trying to get home to visit her parents. Sad story. Sampson's Bay, you can see there a gentle sandy beach with several deep coves and tunnels that were supposedly used for storage of booty, and a deep gully that cuts through the hillside was deep enough to hide hundreds of ponies carrying contraband inland. And a little further along there's Watermouth Bay. Watermouth Castle has a labyrinth of tunnels underneath the site of the original dwelling. They all slope down towards the sea, but they're silted up now as they were below the high tide mark. These would have been perfect to get booty off the shore unnoticed and up to the safety of the manor. And the passage entrances would then disappear, hidden by the rising tide. So on to Coombe Martin and Berry Narber. A bit of a short one here, but from Coombe Martin and Berry Narber in 1825, two other prominent local men were prosecuted for harbouring smuggled goods. John Dovell was the wealthiest man in the area. He was from Coombe Martin, and also a William Lowe of Berry Narber. And I noticed when I was looking at the map that I spotted Sherry Coombe. When you look along the coastline, past Hangman's, you can see there Sherry Coombe. So now we know why it's called Sherry Combe. So I'm going to move on. So back to Heddon's Mouth. So Heddon's Mouth, Trentice Hoe and Heddon's Mouth. Heddon's Mouth had probably been used unnoticed for smuggling for at least 100 years. It's home to the remote lime kiln that we saw at the beginning, and was most likely linked to the earliest records of the limestone boats smuggling into this coast. However, there were no records of it there until the late 1820s and the Trentice Hoe Hall. So when you look at the map here, you can see the ravine-like valley coming in, and Heddon's Mouth Cleave, and up on the village Trentice Hoe at the top. So the authorities had a tip-off that a run had been made. So a local farm owned by John Hoyle, another well-respected local man and a relative of Cook, the Ilfracombe smuggler, was searched. They found holes that had been recently excavated, hiding 38 tubs, 5 gallons apiece of spirits. And the next day, they found holes as big as almost like caves underneath the surrounding area, holding 174 tubs, and later 50 more tubs of spirits, wine, cordials, preserved fruits. But somehow, John Hoyle escaped to the continent and his wife was let off. I think I'm beginning to realise now that in North Devon, a lot of these people who were involved actually were looked upon like Robin Hoods of their time. So Woody Bay, again, plenty of smuggling at Woody Bay. That's looking towards Woody Bay and Lynmouth. Both of these places were renowned smuggling locations. And the Rising Sun. The Rising Sun was smugglers' preferred rest house, and it even supplied the ponies for transporting the contraband. Now, the desperate revenue officials in Ilfracombe really couldn't stop the smuggling, so they recruited extra help from London, hiring the best, the Bow Street runners detectives, to capture the smugglers. But unfortunately, they weren't very successful because all the locals helped the smugglers to escape. Wouldn't you? For your cheap beverages? I'll drink to that one. Now, I thought this was a wonderful testimony written by a naval officer. So this naval officer was writing a history of the Royal Navy, and seafaring smugglers. So the seafaring smugglers, if they were caught, they were made to serve their country. And he wrote about the smugglers. He said, "These men are as remarkable in their skill in seamanship as for their audacity in the hour of danger." So they were far higher quality than the usual men who were scooped up at a pub closing time by the press gangs. Their knowledge has been highly advantageous to the Navy. They are hardy, sober, faithful to each other beyond the generality of seamen. So I like that. I realise that there are a lot of smugglers out there who were very, very good people. But anyway, there are several links. There are a few links to today that I just thought were interesting. Now, one of them is linked to in the mid-1700s. So an interesting link to those smuggling prevention laws that were made in the mid-1700s can be seen on our UK pilot gig boats, which have 3 pairs of oars. Now, I first witnessed a gig boat. These are Spanish gig boats. These are from northern Spain. As a teenager, we sailed to northern Spain. We saw the first gig that I saw of these chaps rowing out. So 6 pairs of oars, was 12 strapping chaps rowing out into the Atlantic. And then obviously now in Britain, so this is our Appledore gig club with just the 3 pairs. The reason is because it became illegal to have more than 3 pairs of oars on a UK pilot gig to slow them down, to make it easier for the preventives to catch. I thought you might like that one. And another very exciting link. 2 Sundays ago, I was walking down to Putsborough with a friend, and walking past me with two people with very, very professional looking metal detectors. And I just got chatting, as you do, because I thought they looked interesting. They might be able to tell me some history. And I told him about this talk that I was doing, and I gave him my link. And that evening, he sent me a messenger photo, and he had found this coin. He was really excited, and it's a 1771 Spanish real coin with in the reign of King Philip II. He said it was their best find yet. So obviously from one of the wrecks that had been wrecked on Mort Stone. So my final thing is, I actually, if you don't know already, I lead walks for health and well-being. These are professionally organised through Walks for Life, used to be called Nordic Walking UK. I lead the walks, a physiotherapist and a qualified Nordic walking instructor. And we're actually doing a series of Sunday walks called the Sunday Smugglers Walks, starting on the 4th of April. They'll be every Sunday, and I'm going to go work my way round the coastline from Heddensmouth all the way back right over to Clovelly. So